Celeste Monroe had always considered herself a master of composure, the kind of woman who could walk into a boardroom full of skeptics and leave them scribbling notes, nodding in agreement, wondering how they ever underestimated her. But as she sat in seat 14C, her seat, the one she'd booked weeks ago for its rare and precious legroom, she felt the edge of that composure begin to fray. The source stood squarely in the aisle, a white woman in oversized sunglasses and practiced indignation, one manicured hand resting on the small shoulder of a little girl no older than 8. "Excuse me," the woman said again, her tone clipped and expectant, like she was asking the world to realign itself around her desire. "My daughter needs to sit by the window. You'll need to move." The request wasn't a question, it was an instruction delivered like gospel. Celeste blinked, heart slowing, her mind already parsing the interaction, not just for what was said, but for what wasn't. She had heard this tone before, disguised as polite, sharpened by entitlement. She had heard it in hotel lobbies, in conference halls, at parent-teacher meetings. The tone that assumed she didn't belong. "I'm sorry," Celeste said, voice steady, jaw clenched just enough to keep her temper from flaring. "This is my assigned seat." She tapped the edge of her boarding pass with one elegant finger, keeping her voice low, civil. "I booked it specifically for the legroom." The child looked at Celeste briefly, uncertain, uncomfortable, then back down at her pink backpack, fingers curling around the strap. But the woman, undeterred, narrowed her eyes and took a half-step closer, as if proximity would pressure Celeste into surrender. Her eyes flicked to Celeste's tailored blazer, her leather portfolio, her natural coils tucked into a low bun. The woman didn't have to say it out loud. The question was already written across her face. "Who are you to sit here?" "My daughter gets anxious during flights," the woman hissed in a stage whisper that traveled far beyond its intended audience. "She needs to sit by the window. Surely you understand that." Oh, Celeste understood. She understood exactly what was happening here. She understood that this woman hadn't asked anyone else in the row. She understood that her polished appearance and black skin had triggered the assumptions that still haunted every corner of American civility. She understood that giving up the seat would feel like confirming something ugly and untrue, that she was less entitled to comfort, less worthy of consideration, more movable, more temporary. "Ma'am," she said, sitting up straighter, voice a little firmer now, "I understand your daughter has needs, but your seats are wherever you were assigned. I won't be moving." The woman's mouth dropped open in a soft gasp, not of surprise, but of insult, like Celeste had just upended the natural order. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Then louder, "I'm going to speak to the flight attendant." Celeste nodded once, cool and unbothered on the outside. "Be my guest." But inside her stomach coiled like a spring. She could feel the heat crawling up her chest, feel the weight of a dozen eyes sliding in her direction. An older man across the aisle gave her a small, solemn nod, the quiet nod of someone who recognized injustice but wasn't quite ready to put his body between it and the person it was targeting. The woman stormed off, the child trailing behind like a reluctant afterthought. Celeste turned back to her laptop. The cursor blinked in the middle of her diversity and inclusion presentation, an irony not lost on her. "What a world," she thought, "where I need to defend my dignity on the way to teaching a corporation how not to destroy other people's." When the footsteps returned, sharp and purposeful, Celeste looked up to see the woman had returned, with a flight attendant in tow. The woman's lips were curled into a triumphant smile, like she'd just summoned reinforcements. "She's refusing to move for a child who has anxiety," the woman announced, already playing to an imagined audience. The flight attendant, young, brown-skinned, and quietly composed, glanced between them. "Ms. Whitfield," she said, checking her tablet, "you and your daughter are assigned to row 22, seats A and B." The woman stiffened. "But those seats don't recline properly, and she needs the window. Surely you can rearrange a few things." "Miss Monroe?" the attendant asked, turning to Celeste. 14C, Celeste said, holding up her boarding pass. "That's correct," the attendant confirmed. Then politely but firmly to Ms. Whitfield, "I'm afraid she's not required to move. If your daughter had special seating needs, those should have been noted during booking." Ms. Whitfield's eyes blazed. I'll remember this the next time I book with your airline, she said, voice cutting the air like ice. You do that, Celeste murmured, just loud enough for herself. As they walked away, the attendant turned to Celeste with a small smile. Anything I can get you before takeoff? Celeste exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. No, thank you. Just thank you. Everyone deserves to fly in peace, the attendant replied, before moving down the aisle. Celeste sat still, heart hammering in her chest, her hands trembling in the way they always did after these moments. The body finally catching up to what the spirit had borne. It wasn't the confrontation that lingered. It was how familiar it all felt. The demand, the assumption, the pressure to accommodate someone else's comfort at the expense of her own. But this time she hadn't moved. This time someone in power hadn't bowed to pressure or folded beneath the weight of a louder voice. And though it was a small thing, a seat on a plane, a few feet of space, it felt like a reclamation, not just of territory, but of truth, of her right to exist in spaces she had earned, to take up space unapologetically. With grace, yes, but also with fire. For a split second, it felt like the entire cabin was holding its breath. The air between Celeste Monroe and the blonde woman, Karen Whitfield, as she confidently introduced herself, had thickened, charged like the sky just before lightning strikes. The aisle, once humming with last-minute boarders, now stood still. Karen's triumphant smirk curled at the edges as she stood beside the flight attendant. She'd fetched like a weapon, a polished badge of white grievance, confident the system would once again contort itself to her comfort. Celeste sat motionless in 14C, hands folded over her laptop like armor, body calm but soul braced. This was the moment that always seemed to go the same way, where authority asked her to smile, to understand, to be the bigger person, to yield. And yet, even now, she hoped, ached for something different. The flight attendant, tall, early 20s, brown skin, a sharp twist out coiled into a neat puff, stood rooted between them. Her name tag read Michaela, and her expression was the kind that made it hard to guess what she was thinking. Karen gestured sharply. This woman, she said, voice lifting just enough to make sure half the cabin could hear, refuses to move for my child. She's being difficult and, honestly, hostile. Celeste clenched her jaw, tasting blood as she bit the inside of her cheek. Hostile. There it was, the word that could unmake everything. The word that never needed evidence, only tone, only bias, only the wrong person in the wrong body at the wrong time. She had been called difficult in rooms where she'd barely spoken. She had been called aggressive for being direct, called intimidating for simply existing with too much presence. She could already feel the weight of it forming behind her eyes. Michaela turned slowly to Celeste. Their eyes met. May I see your boarding pass, ma'am? Celeste handed it over, hands steady even though her pulse thundered in her ears. 14C, she said softly. Michaela scanned it, then tapped something into her tablet. She gave a small nod. That's correct. You're in the right seat, Ms. Monroe. Karen blinked at the first crack of uncertainty breaking through her composure. But my daughter has anxiety. We were assigned seats in row 22, but those don't recline properly. And she needs the window. I'm just asking for a little compassion. Michaela didn't flinch. And I understand that, Ms. Whitfield. But accommodations like that should have been made during booking. Ms. Monroe has an assigned seat, which she paid extra for. She is not required to move. The silence that followed was electric. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she might protest, but Michaela didn't give her the chance. She took a tiny half step forward, barely noticeable, but unmistakably protective. Now, if you'd like, she continued, voice smooth but immovable, I can help you find 2 seats together elsewhere, but Ms. Monroe's seat is not available. Karen's cheeks flushed pink. Unbelievable, she hissed. I'll be filing a complaint. You're welcome to, Michaela replied, entirely unbothered. Our senior flight attendant will be happy to speak with you after takeoff. Karen hesitated, then turned on her heel and stalked back toward the rear of the plane, her child trailing behind with an embarrassed glance over her shoulder. The aisle gradually filled with motion again, quiet murmurs resuming, eyes shifting. Michaela turned back to Celeste and knelt slightly so their eye level matched. I'm sorry that happened, she said quietly, and I'm glad you stood your ground. Celeste stared at her for a moment, blinking against the sudden sting of tears she hadn't anticipated. Not from the confrontation itself, but from the sheer shock of not being dismissed, of being defended, openly, professionally, and without apology. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice cracking a little around the edges. "That means more than you know." Michaela smiled, a real one this time, not the sterile service version. "Everyone deserves to fly in peace," she said. "Let me know if you need anything before takeoff." As she disappeared down the aisle, Celeste sat back in her seat, her body releasing tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was a small moment, one moment, and yet it shook something loose in her, because so often people like her were asked to absorb the harm, to keep the peace, to move so that others could feel more comfortable in their entitlement. So often the official in the blue uniform leaned toward the one who shouted the loudest, the one who weaponized concern and accommodation to mask manipulation. But not today. Not this time. The validation rippled through her chest in waves. It wasn't just that Michaela had enforced the rules. It was that she had seen her. Not just her seat number, but her right to take up space. Her right to say no without being labeled unruly. Her right to choose herself over someone else's expectation of obedience. Celeste thought of how many times she'd explained herself to no avail. How many times she'd played diplomat to her own dignity. This one moment of unexpected allyship, unadorned, clear, firm, was the kind of gesture that could recalibrate a person's trust in the world, even just a little. And if you're still listening, if you're reading this and wondering why a woman simply staying in her seat could mean so much, then let me tell you something. It's never just about the seat. It's about the layers behind it. The history, the battles, the exhaustion of constantly being made to justify your presence. It's about a world where the right to belong isn't always granted, even when earned. It's about how something as small as a row number can become a battleground for worth. But it's also about what happens when someone steps in. When a Michaela decides that fairness isn't optional. When a system representative says not today to entitlement and yes to equity. That kind of courage, quiet, procedural, principled, can make all the difference. And sometimes that difference is a woman sitting taller in her seat, unbothered, unbowed, with her full humanity intact. So if you find yourself in a position of authority, of choice, of voice, be a Michaela. Be the person who tilts the scale back toward justice, even in the small moments. Because those moments add up. Because someone is watching. Because someone is waiting to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, someone's whole story turns because of it. Celeste Monroe was still trying to steady her breathing when the man in the middle seat slid in beside her, a quiet warmth in his eyes that disarmed her more than she expected. He didn't say anything at first, just offered a polite nod as he settled in, giving her space, letting the silence do the talking. Celeste appreciated that. After the confrontation with Karen Whitfield, after the humiliation masked as civility, the tension in her body felt like metal wiring strung too tight to touch. She was trying, desperately, to refocus on the pitch deck glowing from her laptop screen, but her fingers trembled too much to type. That's when the man leaned in slightly, not too close, his voice low enough to not draw attention. "Excuse me," he said, "but I just wanted to say, you handled that with real grace." Celeste turned, surprised. The man, tall, clean-shaven, with soft brown eyes behind stylish glasses, held her gaze, not with pity or spectacle, but something quieter. Respect. Recognition. "Marcus Green," he added, extending his hand. "HR Director. Telstra Financial." She shook it, still reeling slightly. "Celeste Monroe, Organizational Strategist. And thank you." A pause. "I tried." "I know that look," Marcus said gently, settling back into his seat. "Trying not to show too much emotion, because the wrong expression could get you labeled angry or aggressive." Celeste blinked at him, then gave a tired half-smile. "You've been there?" "Too many times," he said, letting out a short breath. "I once got pulled aside during a leadership retreat and told I was being too intense because I questioned a panelist about pay equity. Half the room thanked me afterward. The other half stopped making eye contact with me. That brought the first real laugh out of her, a quiet, surprised sound that she hadn't felt bubbling until it escaped. Classic, she said. I once had a CEO say I was very polished for someone from North Philly. He meant it as a compliment. Marcus winced. Yikes. They shared a glance, one of those fleeting, wordless exchanges that carried more weight than a paragraph ever could. It was in that glance that something shifted. Not romance, not yet, but alignment, kinship, an understanding that came not from similarity of title or resume, but from the bruises you earn navigating spaces never built with you in mind. Then, as if summoned by memory, Celeste's phone lit up with a notification, a photo, a forwarded message from her younger brother. She tapped it open out of instinct, and immediately her smile faded. The photo was grainy, taken from across a hotel lobby. It showed Celeste, clearly her, clear enough that there was no denying it, standing near a check-in counter, holding her carry-on. Her caption read, "This is what entitlement looks like." She cut it in line, then made a scene when staff didn't prioritize her. The post had nearly 3,000 likes and dozens of comments. Marcus glanced over, noticing her face shift. "Everything okay?" Celeste hesitated for half a second, then turned the phone toward him. "Apparently I went viral. Last week I asked a hotel manager why my room had been given away despite my confirmed reservation. The woman behind me took a picture and posted it online, claiming I was throwing a fit. I hadn't raised my voice once." Marcus frowned. "You're kidding." "Nope." She zoomed in. "Look, my mouth is closed. I'm literally listening. But the comments..." She scrolled slowly. "These types always think rules don't apply to them. Of course it's someone like her." Her voice grew quieter. "The worst part, this isn't even the first time. And each time, it chips something away from you. It makes you wonder how many other people see you that way, even when you are doing everything right." Marcus stared at the screen, jaw tightening. That's not just frustrating, that's dangerous. People weaponize perception like it's harmless, but it shapes how we're treated, especially when it follows you into spaces you worked hard to earn your way into. Exactly. Celeste nodded, grateful he didn't minimize it. And it's exhausting to be brilliant, composed, unshakable, because anything less gets twisted into a reason to doubt you. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the plane vibrating softly beneath them. Then Marcus said, "I hope this isn't too forward, but do you ever talk about this kind of stuff in your work?" Celeste gave him a side glance. "All the time. I build frameworks for corporate clients, ones that go beyond hiring. My pitch tomorrow is about retention and advancement, how companies lose people not because they're not qualified, but because they're tired of fighting to belong." Marcus smiled, and it was genuine. "We launched something similar last quarter, an internal mentorship initiative, but I'd love to hear more about your work." She looked at him, surprised again by how easily they were connecting, how naturally her guard was lowering around this stranger who somehow wasn't strange at all. "We could talk more after the flight, maybe." "I'd like that," he said. "Coffee, if you're free?" She nodded. "After my pitch." It wasn't flirtation, not really. It was something deeper than that. A connection forged not in chemistry but in clarity. The kind of understanding that only forms when someone sees the exact thing you usually have to explain. And maybe that's why this conversation mattered so much. Because after being misrepresented, misunderstood, and nearly erased before takeoff, Celeste found something rare at 35,000 feet. A person who didn't ask her to shrink. A person who didn't question her reality. And if you've ever known what it feels like to be too visible and yet unseen, if you've ever had to wear a mask just to sit comfortably in public, then you understand how profound even a moment of true connection can be. Because sometimes the most unexpected part of adversity isn't the battle. It's the ally who finds you in the middle of it and stays. Celeste Monroe had walked into hundreds of conference rooms in her career, each one carrying the same static hum of anticipation, the same neutral decor designed to impress without offending, the same underlying assumption that she didn't quite belong. She had long since trained her body to hold itself with quiet defiance, shoulders back, steps measured, chin high, eyes direct, because every space like this had a test hidden somewhere inside it. But this time the test was waiting for her with a name and a face she already knew. As she stepped into the glass-walled conference room on the 47th floor of Davenport Financial, she froze, not visibly, but enough that her breath caught just slightly in her throat. There, seated calmly at the far end of the table in a Navy power suit, was Karen Whitfield, the same Karen who just 2 days prior had tried to shame her out of her airplane seat in front of half a cabin. And now, in a twist of fate so precise it felt scripted, Karen was not just present, she was head of talent acquisition for the very firm Celeste had come to consult, a key stakeholder, a decision maker, a gatekeeper. And for a split second, Celeste felt her composure wobble, as though the ground beneath her immaculate pumps had shifted without warning. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she nodded, smiled that tightly rehearsed professional smile, and extended her hand across the conference table like she hadn't been insulted by this woman's entitlement less than 48 hours ago. "Ms. Whitfield," she said evenly, "we meet again." Karen's return handshake was brief, her smile even briefer. "Small world," she replied, voice smooth but tinged with something that wasn't quite apology and not quite threat either. Just a simmering calculation that said, "You're on my turf now." Celeste felt the weight of that look. She knew it intimately. It was the kind of look that said, "I didn't get my way before, but this time I'm the one with the microphone." And still, Celeste remained calm, because this was what it meant to be a Black woman in power. To walk into rooms already stained with someone else's grudge and still led with grace, to stand at the intersection of someone's past humiliation and their current control and not flinch. But let's not sugarcoat this moment. Her heart was pounding. Her fingers, carefully folded on the table, were fighting not to curl into fists, because this right here, was the danger of being visible, of being excellent. Sometimes the people you embarrass with your boundaries will follow you into the next chapter just to try to rewrite it. As the meeting began, Celeste launched into her presentation. She delivered her framework with sharp precision, detailing her strategy for transforming Davenport's shallow diversity metrics into meaningful, measurable systems for equity, inclusion, and retention. She cited statistics, industry trends, success stories from prior clients. She addressed challenges before they could be raised, and through it all, she refused to let her gaze falter. Even when she could feel Karen watching her with a cold stillness that scraped against her skin like frost. The rest of the room nodded along. The COO asked thoughtful questions. The VP of HR scribbled notes. Even the general counsel leaned forward in interest. But Karen? Karen said nothing, just sat there in silence, her perfectly poised hand gliding across her notebook as though documenting flaws only she could see. And then, when Celeste reached the portion of the presentation that detailed accountability metrics, the section that always made leaders a little nervous, Karen finally spoke. "This all sounds very ambitious," she said, her tone dripping with condescension disguised as caution. "But I wonder if our current resources can support such a drastic shift. After all, we already have diversity initiatives in place." Celeste met her gaze, steady, controlled. "That's exactly the issue," she replied. "Most companies have initiatives. Few have impact. My framework doesn't replace what you've built. It integrates it. It aligns your efforts across recruitment, retention, and advancement. Because checking boxes isn't the same as building equity. And when companies don't evolve, they fall behind." Karen's lips thinned, but she said nothing else. And the CEO, Richard Davenport, leaned forward. "Those numbers are compelling, Ms. Monroe. Innovation metrics especially. This could be exactly the transformation we've been waiting for. But here's the part that burns the most, that cuts deeper than it should." Celeste knew this pitch had landed. She'd won the room. And still, she could feel the possibility that Karen might sabotage it, not because it lacked value, but because it came from someone who had once publicly refused to defer to her, someone who didn't shrink when told to move. And now Celeste needs you, yes, you, the listener, the reader, the witness. Because every Celeste out there, every woman who has dared to claim her space in a world that resents her presence, needs to be seen not just when she rises, but when the system quietly tries to drag her down behind closed doors. She needs allies who understand that excellence is not armor, that grace under fire should not be a requirement just to be heard, that even the most composed woman at the table is still human beneath the poise. So if you're reading this, if you feel her courage, if you recognize the stakes, stand with her. Let her know she's not walking into those rooms alone. Share her story, say her name. Push back against the idea that professionalism means silence. And remember this, Celeste didn't just come to impress a boardroom. She came to rebuild a system. And no matter who tries to block the door, she's already inside. Celeste Monroe stood before the gleaming conference table in the beacon room of Davenport Financial, her heart steady but her spirit burning. The room was full of power. 5 senior executives, each holding influence over millions in budget, thousands of employees, and the future of her proposal. It should have been intimidating, maybe even overwhelming. But Celeste wasn't here to shrink. She wasn't here to prove she belonged. She was here to lead. The weight of the moment wasn't just about her. It was about every Black woman who had ever walked into a room like this carrying twice the credentials just to be seen as half as capable. And today, with her strategy for transforming Davenport's outdated diversity initiatives into something real, something structural, something lasting, Celeste was ready. Dressed in charcoal gray, her natural curls neatly tucked, her tone was clear, warm, authoritative. She opened her laptop, the screen blinking awake with her title slide, From Checkboxes to Culture, Building Equity Beyond Optics. It was more than a pitch, it was a call to conscience. And just a few feet away, sitting at the long end of the table like a silent storm, was Karen Whitfield. The same woman who had once tried to shame her out of an airplane seat was now seated as a gatekeeper to the very future Celeste was here to help shape. Their earlier encounter wasn't spoken aloud, but it filled the space like smoke, unseen yet thick, pulsing with tension. And still, Celeste never once looked away. "Thank you all for the opportunity," she began, projecting confidence with every syllable. "I've studied your current inclusion framework, and what I'd like to share today is a roadmap not just to improve it, but to transform it into a lived culture." Her slides advanced, each one carefully crafted, data points, retention figures, innovation statistics. "Too often," she continued, "companies celebrate diversity in hiring, but ignore the reality of promotion bottlenecks, implicit bias in evaluations, and culture gaps that alienate talent once they're through the door. Representation matters, yes, but retention defines success. Advancement defines integrity. My model addresses all three." She moved from strategy to system, outlining department-level implementation, feedback loops, and accountability tracking. Around the table, eyes sharpened, pens moved. Even Richard Davenport himself, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward, visibly engaged. The COO, Elizabeth Wells, asked thoughtful questions about timeline and cross-department collaboration. The VP of HR scribbled notes with urgency. The general counsel tapped the table lightly with interest when Celeste spoke about legal safeguards and bias mitigation. And then, the stillness. The silence that always comes before opposition finds its voice. Karen Whitfield cleared her throat. "This is certainly a polished presentation," she said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "But I'm curious, how do we justify the resource investment? We already have several diversity programs in place. What makes this one worth more time, more budget, and frankly, more disruption?" It was the kind of question designed to appear neutral while cutting deep. But Celeste didn't flinch. Not because it didn't sting, but because she'd heard it before. Too many times. Polished, as if that's all her decades of experience in data amounted to. Polish. Disruption. As if change that lifts the marginalized is somehow chaos for the privileged. "Thank you for the question," Celeste said evenly. She clicked to the next slide. "Here's what we know. Companies with integrated, data-backed diversity frameworks experience a 27% increase in underrepresented employee retention, a 35% boost in innovation metrics, and they attract 18% more top-tier applicants in competitive markets. These aren't theoretical numbers. They come from companies who stopped treating inclusion as a side project and started treating it as a strategic advantage. The disruption isn't from change, it's from stagnation." Karen didn't speak again, but Richard Davenport did. "Those innovation metrics align with our 5-year plan. This could be exactly the momentum we need." And with that, The tide turned. For the next 20 minutes, the room was alive with real engagement. Elizabeth asked about integrating mentorship programs. James Harrington, the HR VP, asked if Celeste would be available to advise on performance review redesign. By the time Celeste delivered her closing slide, culture is not what we say, it's what we reward. Even the most skeptical faces had softened. All but one. As the meeting wrapped, Celeste shut her laptop slowly, savoring the subtle power of having held the room. Not with theatrics, not with charm, with clarity, with truth, with earned authority. The executives filed out one by one, shaking her hand, exchanging cards, promising follow-up. But Karen stayed. She approached as Celeste packed her bag, standing close enough that the air between them seemed to vibrate. "Quite a coincidence," Karen said, voice lower now, more measured. "You on that flight, and then here." Celeste met her eyes. "Not really. Davenport's a leading firm. Chicago's a major city. I do this work nationally. The odds weren't that long." There was no smile on Celeste's face, just composure. Karen studied her for a beat. "You're very strategic." The way she said it sounded like both a compliment and a warning. "I try to be," Celeste said. "It helps when you're building something that lasts." Karen nodded once. "Well, these decisions aren't mine alone." "Of course," Celeste said. "That's why I designed the proposal with shared implementation in mind. Everyone's invested in the outcome." There was nothing more to say. But you, dear listener, you still have something to say. If you've ever rooted for the underdog who refused to flinch, if you've ever watched someone carry grace like armor into rooms designed to test their limits, if you've ever seen quiet strength go head-to-head with silent sabotage, then don't just scroll past. Leave a comment for Celeste. Tell her she's not alone. Tell her you see her strength. Tell her she did exactly what needed to be done. Because sometimes the difference between breaking and rising is knowing someone out there is cheering for you. And today, Celeste Monroe showed up, stood firm, and turned a room full of skepticism into a room full of momentum. Let her know she's not standing on that line by herself anymore. Amara Jackson hadn't expected the text from Elizabeth Wells, the COO of Davenport Financial, to rattle her. But as she sat at the cafe across from the executive the next morning, she realized it wasn't the meeting itself that unnerved her. It was what it represented. A quiet meeting, off-site, no agenda, no assistants, just two women in the corner of a chic downtown cafe, coffee cups warming their hands, a silent current of unspoken truth stretching between them. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Elizabeth said, her voice low but steady, before things moved forward. Outside, Chicago pulsed with late morning life. Horns, foot traffic, ambition. Inside, Amara felt something else stirring, tension, tempered by the awareness that this conversation could change the entire trajectory of the work she'd come to do. "I'll be direct," Elizabeth continued, eyes sharp but not unkind. "There's a faction within Davenport that sees your proposal as threatening, not because it's flawed, but because it's real. And change, real change, always shakes something loose." Amara sat back slightly, not surprised but still pierced by the bluntness. She nodded. "And Karen?" The question was quiet, but it landed like glass on tile. Elizabeth sighed, a gesture of someone who's navigated too many rooms where the truth had to be dressed in diplomacy. "Karen leads that faction." Amara didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked out the window, her reflection faint in the glass, a composed woman in a fitted coat, braids swept back, a portfolio at her side filled with solutions that too many people would rather avoid than implement. "She's built her career," Elizabeth continued, "on incrementalism, small wins, press releases, surface-level diversity that doesn't challenge power structures." She paused. "Your framework, hiring, promotion equity, accountability, it threatens that comfort." Amara met her eyes again. "I'm not here for comfort," she said. "I'm here for culture shift." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "That's why I asked to meet you, because I believe we need that shift. And I believe you might actually get us there." That small flicker of belief, a match struck in a dark room, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through Amara. She had been here before, in other boardrooms, in other cities, offering truth to institutions that claimed to want it. And she knew how lonely that truth-telling could be. She had spent entire weeks embedded in companies that smiled in her face and undermined her in email chains. And always, there was a Karen. Sometimes more than one, sometimes in HR, sometimes on the board, sometimes in PR. But always a Karen who couldn't say out loud what she feared. So she questioned in the budget, the timing, the fit. And here in Davenport, the Karen from the plane had become something more. A familiar face now wrapped in corporate influence. You're not walking into a neutral space, Elizabeth said, but you do have allies, quiet ones. And one of them isn't so quiet, Julian Washington. Amara sat up straighter. She remembered Julian's name from the board roster, a longtime advocate for equity and a former executive director of the Chicago Urban League. He's been trying to push the board to take this work seriously for years, Elizabeth said. He was instrumental in convincing Richard to bring in outside consultation. He'll support you, loudly if needed. Amara felt a swell of something she hadn't allowed herself since landing in Chicago. Relief. Not because the path ahead would be easy, but because she wasn't walking it alone. We need to be careful, Elizabeth said. Karen won't overtly block the project, not with board support, but she has tools. She knows how to delay meetings, deflect commitments, quietly influence department heads to prioritize other initiatives. Amara recognized the strategy. It was the same passive resistance that often derailed meaningful change. Not open war, just friction, just enough static to wear you down, just enough politeness to make you look dramatic if you called it out. She looked at Elizabeth, searching her face. Why tell me all this? The older woman didn't flinch. Because I've watched too many black women step into these roles alone, and I've watched the system smile at them while quietly setting tripwires. The honesty hit Amara with such force she had to steady her breath. I'm tired of watching that happen, Elizabeth added, so I'm telling you where the tripwires are. For a moment, Amara couldn't speak. There was something deeply humbling about hearing another woman in power name the truth that most people danced around. She reached for her coffee, the warmth grounding her hands, then said quietly, "Thank you. I've stepped on those tripwires before. I know what they can cost." Elizabeth nodded. Then maybe this time we disarm them before they spark. The two women sat in quiet understanding. And you, the one listening, can you feel that? Can you feel what it means to be offered quiet alliance in a world that so often offers polite sabotage? Can you feel the weight Amara's carrying, not just of the strategy, but of the stakes? Because this isn't just a proposal. It's a blueprint for change. And the resistance? It isn't just Karen. It's the culture that taught Karen that slow motion counts as progress. It's every email laced with the word concern. It's every hallway conversation that begins with, "I'm just not sure they're a fit." So here's where you come in. If you believe in Amara's fight, show her. Leave a comment. Tell her that her truth matters. Tell her she's not alone in the room anymore. Tell her you're watching and cheering and walking beside her, even from afar, because change doesn't come quietly, and neither do the women who carry it. The Chicago Cultural Center glowed like a cathedral of ambition that evening, its historic glass domes casting soft halos of light over a sea of tuxedos and satin gowns, clinking glasses, and curated smiles. Amara Jackson stepped through the grand arched entrance on the arm of Marcus Green, her midnight blue gown catching every glimmer like a constellation. The kind of presence that turned heads not because it begged for attention, but because it held its own. She belonged here. Not as a guest, not as a tag-along consultant, but as a leader. And yet, even as she crossed the marble floor, her spine straight and her expression calm, she could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the tension of invisible threads pulling tight around her. Because she wasn't just walking into a gala, she was walking into a chessboard, and the queen on the opposing side was already at play. Karen Whitfield was everywhere, smiling, gliding, posing with donors, greeting board members like old friends. The same woman who had tried to make Amara feel small on an airplane. The same woman who had questioned her proposal with velvet-coated barbs. And tonight, Karen shimmered with a kind of practiced elegance. Draped in a red designer gown, her laughter lilting at just the right volume, her eyes sharp behind every sip of champagne. It was the kind of evening designed to showcase power, not distribute it. But Amara moved through the space like water through stone, flowing around the small pockets of judgment, through the polite curiosity, into conversations where she could plant something real. She spoke with board member Julian Washington, who clasped her hand with warmth and whispered, "Don't worry about the noise, you've already shifted the room." She met Gloria, his wife, a federal judge with the kind of voice that could silence a courtroom and lift a spirit in the same breath. She found herself in an easy conversation with a tech philanthropist who offered to share data on how equity had transformed his company culture. For every sidelong glance, every whisper disguised as curiosity, there was a counterforce, a nod, a smile, a hand on her back that said, "We see you." But the undercurrent of tension thickened the moment Karen approached their table. She came with her committee chair smile, the one that shined like polish but left no fingerprints. "I trust everyone is enjoying the evening," she said, her gaze sweeping over the table before resting, briefly but pointedly, on Amara. "The program will begin in 15 minutes, followed by dancing and the silent auction results." Her tone was warm, but Amara could feel the chill behind it. The subtle reminder that Karen was still here, still watching. Julian lifted his glass in polite acknowledgement. "As always, Karen, you've outdone yourself." "Thank you," Karen replied. The words are directed at Julian, but the subtext unmistakably for Amara. "See how they praise me. See how I move among them." And then turning, she added, "Miss Jackson, enjoying your first Davenport Gala?" "Very much," Amara said smoothly, her voice like silk-wrapped steel. "The educational initiative is impressive. Real impact, real lives changed." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Authentic community impact does require sustained commitment," she said. "Not just fashionable initiatives that look good in annual reports." The words hung in the air, sweetened by tone but sharpened at the edges. Amara could have returned fire. She could have named every hollow program Karen had signed off on, every staffer who had quietly confessed their disillusionment during the discovery phase. But instead, she tilted her head, lips curved in a quiet, unshaken smile. "I couldn't agree more. That's why sustainability is built into every layer of my framework." Marcus shifted beside her, just a subtle adjustment, a silent affirmation. And across the table, Julian's wife murmured, "Some people can't help showing their hand." Amara kept her smile in place, but inside she felt the burn of every moment she'd been expected to take the high road while others bulldozed through protocol, grace, or truth. When Karen finally moved on, the table exhaled. "You handled that beautifully," said the young tech executive, admiration clear in his voice. "It's not easy to match polish with principle." And that right there was the emotional line Amara walked every day. Polish with principle. She wasn't just here to perform professionalism. She was here to transform it, to unspool it from its rigid traditions and reweave it with justice, humanity, and integrity. And still, she had to make it elegant enough to be heard, digestible enough to be adopted, strong enough to survive the scrutiny of people like Karen. As the program began, she stood beside Marcus and listened to students speak, young Black and brown voices detailing how the Davenport Educational Fund had changed their futures. She clapped, she smiled, she even allowed herself a moment to feel pride. Because despite the battles in the boardroom, this, the actual lives changed, the futures unlocked, was the point. But then Karen took the stage, thanking donors, spotlighting the committee, talking about legacy and shared purpose. Her words flawless and hollow all at once. Amara watched her with a strange ache, part sadness, part fury, because she knew Karen's type too well. Women who fought to maintain power by controlling the narrative, not the truth. Women who wore inclusion like a designer coat, luxury on the outside, cold on the inside. And yet, even here, surrounded by wealth and influence and performance, Amara felt something shifting. A conversation with Julian led to a conversation with the board chair. A compliment from the COO led to a new invitation. The people who mattered were watching, not just the gala, but her, watching how she moved, how she responded, how she refused to fold under subtle fire. She danced once with Marcus, slow, grounded, warm, and as they moved across the floor, he leaned in and whispered, "Whatever she's trying to do tonight, it's not working. You've already won more than she knows." And now to you, yes, you, the one still listening, still feeling this unfold. Tell Amara what you see. Tell her you saw the grace it took to meet subtle hostility with unshakable dignity. Tell her you saw through the mask and you recognize the real face of leadership. Tell her you're in her corner and she doesn't have to dance through fire alone. Because in a world full of polished performers, Amara Jackson showed us what real power looks like. She walked through that gala in heels and truth and didn't flinch. The call came just after noon, while Amara Jackson sat alone in her hotel room, still wearing the navy blue blazer she'd chosen that morning for confidence, for control, for armor. She'd been replaying the boardroom moments in her mind, counting all the places where Karen Whitfield could have intervened, subtly, strategically, spitefully, and tried to undercut her. The waiting gnawed at her nerves, even as she reminded herself that her proposal was strong, her delivery sharper than it had ever been, her metrics irrefutable. And yet, logic never fully shielded a black woman from the sting of rejection that could be dressed up in a dozen polite lies. But when Richard Davenport's voice came through her phone, warm and direct, with the words, "We've reviewed your proposal and we'd like to move forward," Amara didn't smile, not right away. Instead, she went still, the kind of stillness that only comes after holding too much for too long. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a quiet, almost sacred release. She had won, despite Karen, despite the pressure, despite the mental math she'd done in real time just to keep her tone from being misread as too assertive, her gaze from being labeled too bold, her pauses from being interpreted as incompetence. She had made it through the fire, and on the other side was not just a signed contract, but validation. She had told the truth, demanded better, and been heard. She barely had time to process it before her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Marcus. "Still on for 12:30 at Lakefront Cafe." And then a follow-up. "Unless you want to celebrate somewhere fancier?" For the first time that day, Amara smiled. Not a professional smile, a real one. "Yes," she replied. "Lakefront is perfect. Just landed the contract." His response came almost instantly. "Knew you would. You're the most formidable woman I've met in a long time." By the time she arrived at the cafe, Marcus was already seated by the window, his posture relaxed, eyes lighting up when he saw her. There was something deeply comforting in his presence, not because he tried to fix anything, but because he saw her. Fully, and that felt rarer than any deal she'd ever signed. They talked over coffee, their conversation flowing easily from work to music to childhood stories. And when he offered a toast, with nothing more than an iced tea in hand, it felt more intimate than any gala champagne. "To contracts signed," he said, "to dignity kept. To unexpected allies," Amara added, lifting her glass. "And maybe something more," he said, his eyes holding hers just a second longer. And for a moment, the weight of everything, the pressure, the performance, the armor, melted into something soft, something unfamiliar and tentative. Hope. That night, after dinner with her mother, Vivian, who hugged her so tight she nearly dropped her briefcase, Amara returned to her hotel room to find an envelope slid under her door. At first, she thought it was from Marcus, but when she opened it, her chest tightened. It was from the front desk, a printed note. "Ms. Jackson, we regret to inform you that an anonymous guest submitted a noise complaint about your conduct in the lobby yesterday. Security reviewed the tape and found no violations. We apologize for any inconvenience." There had been no raised voices, no incident, just her standing by the fireplace waiting for Marcus, laughing once when he jokingly called her boss lady for landing the contract. That had been enough, apparently, for someone to feel the need to report her. She sat on the bed, the paper still in her hands, and felt the sting of it. Not because the hotel had sided against her, they hadn't, but because someone had still felt entitled to watch her, judge her, accuse her. And it reminded her, painfully, that no amount of success could make her invisible to that gaze, the one that reduced her to a threat for existing, for laughing, for being seen and unafraid. When she told Marcus about it the next day over breakfast, he didn't brush it off. He didn't tell her to forget it or spin it into something motivational. Instead, he said, "That's the weight you carry, the one they never see. And the fact that you keep showing up anyway, that's the kind of strength most people don't even know how to name." She looked at him then, eyes stinging, and for once didn't swallow it down. It's lonely sometimes, she said, even in victory. He nodded. I know. And he reached across the table, took her hand, and held it, not like a rescue, but like a promise. Later that afternoon, she received another message, this one from Julian Washington, the board member, the quiet ally. Would you be open to a phone call this week? I'd like to talk about extending your framework to our mentorship program. Amara knew what that meant. It meant trust. It meant Julian was trying to build her influence deeper into the company's foundation, where even Karen couldn't touch it. And that mattered. It mattered so much. And yet, not all victories come with closure. As she waited for her flight home, Amara saw Karen one last time, across the terminal. The woman was dressed impeccably, of course, wheeling a monogrammed carry-on and speaking into her phone. She glanced up and saw Amara but didn't look away. Instead, she gave a small, unreadable smile, not friendly, not hostile, just unfinished. Amara returned the look with calm, not because she felt triumphant, but because she knew the truth. Karen hadn't stopped her, and that truth would echo louder than anything either of them could say. Now, if you're still listening, if you've felt the weight of Amara's journey, then this is the moment to step forward. Comment below to remind her that what she's done matters. Tell her you see her strength, not just the power in her voice, but the pain she carried beneath it. Tell her she didn't win because she was perfect. She won because she was brave. And tell her that even when the world tries to rewrite the narrative, she's already authored her own. Because Amara Jackson didn't just close a deal, she opened a door, and she walked through it, whole. It had been 32 days since Amara Jackson signed the contract with Davenport Financial, and she had already learned more about the company's internal fractures than any document could have prepared her for. From her temporary office on the 42nd floor, a glass-walled corner tucked away from the buzz of the executive suites, she had built the foundation of her implementation plan piece by piece, department by department. What looked seamless on paper took grit and finesse in practice. She'd spent hours in listening sessions, mapping out where real pain lived beneath the polished surface of corporate language, microaggressions buried in feedback forms, promotion gaps dressed up as lack of cultural fit, entire teams where diverse voices went quiet out of self-preservation. But what Amara didn't expect, what still took the breath from her lungs some days, was how insidious resistance could be when it wore a professional smile. Karen Whitfield, the head of talent acquisition, hadn't openly challenged the initiative. She didn't need to. Instead, she delayed key meetings by claiming calendar congestion, offered incomplete data when asked for turnover trends, and whispered subtle warnings to department heads that the new framework was too aggressive too soon. And each time Amara tried to push forward, she could feel Karen's fingerprints smudging the progress. Not enough to stop it, but enough to slow it. And that kind of slow resistance, that was the one that burned the most. Amara sat at her desk late one evening, the city glowing behind her, files spread out like a battlefield of truths and half-truths. Her back ached, her fingers trembled from typing out a detailed summary of missed deadlines and vague emails that, if needed, she would present to Elizabeth Wells and the board. But more than that, her heart hurt, because she had done everything right. She had built trust. She had listened more than she'd spoken. She had come not to accuse, but to transform. And still, she was being met with doors that looked open but slammed shut behind emails. And it would have been easy, so easy to break, to soften her strategy, to shrink. But Amara didn't come this far to yield to someone else's comfort. She had built her name on clarity, her leadership on courage. And even if she was the only one in the room as saying the uncomfortable thing, she was going to say it. Because that was the promise she made to herself, to every younger version of herself who'd been silenced, and to every woman watching this initiative with quiet, desperate hope. Still, she wasn't entirely alone. Julian Washington, true to his word, called weekly. He'd once told her, the power's not just in the title, it's in who's willing to say the hard thing in the boardroom when the door's closed. And he had. At the last board check-in, he'd asked Karen, pointedly, why the turnover report hadn't been submitted in full. Karen had offered an explanation about system updates, but Amara saw her flinch. The truth was, Julian's presence had kept the playing field from tipping. And Elizabeth Wells? She quietly routed around Karen more than once, sending Amara directly to department VPs, ensuring Amara's work didn't bottleneck. I can't remove every obstacle, Elizabeth had told her, but I can make sure you're not walking blindfolded into sabotage. Amara never said it aloud, but that sentence had kept her going through 2 sleepless nights. There was a moment, just last week, when Amara had caught Karen standing in the hallway outside the conference room after a session. The expression on Karen's face wasn't one of fury, it was fear, a flicker of it, because Karen had built her domain on control. She'd been the face of performative inclusion for years, the one who smiled at panels, sponsored mentorship lunches, sent out Heritage Month newsletters. But Amara? She'd come in with spreadsheets, with metrics, with systems that couldn't be deflected with charm. And somewhere inside Karen, that truth was calcifying into resistance. Amara could feel it, even when Karen's email said, "Looking forward to collaborating." And now you, the one reading, listening, following this story, this is where you come in, because you need to know what it takes to keep going under that pressure. What it means to be tasked with building equity while being gaslit by politeness. What it costs to keep your tone measured when your work is being diluted behind your back. What it feels like to walk into a meeting knowing someone across the table is praying you'll stumble, just once, so they can call your courage unprofessional. So please don't just scroll past. Like, if you believe in Amara's mission, comment if you've ever seen someone fight for change with dignity while being dismissed in silence. Tell Amara that her clarity, her conviction, and her refusal to shrink matters. Because the truth is, Amara isn't just implementing a program. She's carrying the emotional labor of 100 unheard voices. She's defying the quiet sabotage of the status quo. And she's doing it with grace that should be applauded, not expected. That night, as Amara stood by the window looking out at the city, she placed a call to her assistant and made a bold decision. She would recommend to Elizabeth and Julian that they host a company-wide equity summit, not next quarter, now. Not tucked away in an internal newsletter, but broadcast across departments. She would suggest Karen be invited to co-lead a panel, not to flatter her, but to put her publicly on record. To give her the opportunity to rise or reveal herself. This was the new phase. No more polite detours. It was time to move forward. And to anyone who believes in building something better, not just in theory, but in messy, complicated practice, Amara Jackson could use your voice. Leave a comment to let her know she's not doing this work alone. Tell her that her leadership is felt. Tell her that her strength is seen. Because when women like Amara win, the whole system gets a little more honest. And that is always worth fighting for. By the time Amara Jackson stepped off her final flight back home to Philadelphia, everything had changed. Not just around her, but within her. She had arrived in Chicago weeks ago with a carefully structured proposal, an ironclad strategy, and a schedule that didn't account for curveballs. But what unfolded had been something else entirely. The initial confrontation with Karen Whitfield on the plane, an act of arrogance and entitlement meant to belittle her, had become the thread that unraveled an entire system of complacency. What began as a struggle to hold her assigned seat had transformed into a season of reclaiming something far greater. Her purpose, her power, and her peace. Now, as she stood on her mother's porch in the golden evening light, the crisp spring air carrying the scent of lilacs and resilience, Amara finally allowed herself to breathe, really breathe, for the first time in what felt like months. She had not only launched the equity initiative at Davenport Financial, but had earned the trust of the board, the respect of her peers, and the reluctant cooperation of even the most resistant departments. And Karen? Well, after a company-wide summit that forced her to engage with real accountability, she had started showing up differently. Whether out of sincere reflection or self-preservation, Amara didn't know. But the point was, she had changed the culture. Without yelling, without compromising, with clarity, dignity, and truth. The final milestone had come just days earlier when Julian Washington invited Amara to return, not just as a consultant, but as an official advisor on Davenport's newly formed Equity Leadership Council. She'd accepted, knowing that this wasn't just a career win, it was legacy work. It was building scaffolding for the next generation of Amaras who would walk into those boardrooms with less burden and more backing. And perhaps the most unexpected gift of all, Marcus. What began as a chance meeting on a turbulent day had grown into something honest, steady, and real. He'd flown out to Philly twice since the gala, and just last night, while they shared dinner beneath the soft flicker of candlelight, he'd told her, "You don't have to be invincible with me. I see all of you, and I choose all of you." She had blinked back tears, not because she was fragile, but because it was the first time in a long time someone had reminded her that she didn't always have to carry the world alone. As she curled up that evening with her journal in hand and a cup of tea by her side, Amara reflected on all she had learned, not from books, not from strategy decks, but from living through it, from being tested, from standing still when she was told to move, and finding her voice in spaces that tried to shrink it. She wrote one simple sentence at the top of the page: "Growth lives where courage meets adversity." That was the truth that had carried her. That was the truth she wanted others to carry, too. And you, dear listener, dear reader, you who followed her journey from that tense moment on the airplane to this hard-earned joy. This story was never just about Amara. It's about all of us. About how we rise when we're underestimated. About how we find our voice even when someone's trying to write us out of the narrative. About how we hold space for ourselves and for others when the world says there's not enough room. So if you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or asked to step aside for someone else's comfort, if you've ever had to weigh every word, every tone, every breath just to be heard, if you've ever had to do twice the work from half the credit just to prove you deserve to be where you already are, then this is your reminder. You are not alone. Your strength is not in how loud you shout, but in how deeply you stand. And your dignity, that's your power. So let's lift Amara up in the comments. Tell her you see her. Tell her you've been there too. Tell her she's not just a character, she's a reflection of your strength, your hope, your resilience. And if her journey moved you, if her story reminded you that adversity can be the birthplace of purpose, then, like this story to show your support, comment to celebrate every person who's had to fight for a seat they already earned. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that reminds you what quiet courage looks like. Because more stories like Amara's are coming. Stories that honor resilience. Stories that speak truth. Stories that remind you that when you stay rooted in who you are, you cannot be moved. So stay with us, stay inspired, and keep walking forward, just like Amara did. Because you never know when your next moment of adversity might just be the beginning of your breakthrough.